All right, welcome to Summit. It's very nice to see you guys here, and I hope you get to take away something special with you after the presentation's done. In terms of ways of working, I'm going to run through my complete slide deck. Once I'm done, I probably will not have time for questions. However, the inside booth is located just over there. If you could please find us directly afterwards for more information and for us to be able to assist you with any sort of questions that you have, that would be brilliant. So my name is Stephen Lundell. I've been with Inside for approximately 8 to 10 years, somewhere around about there. I've been always working in the area of data engineering and also AI. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the United States originally. I was actually part of the Inside offices in Australia and moved over around about 2 years ago and joined the Inside team here in the United States. So that's a little bit of background from me. I've been working in the industry for around about 15 years. So I have been around the block, as you can say. And how many of us, a show of hands, how many of you actually made it to the keynote this morning? All right, excellent. So the pre-note speech is actually quite a good prequel to what we're going to be covering today. And basically what you'll be seeing is you'll be seeing a high-level architecture with regards to the democratization of data, utilizing apps within Databricks. So walking around between the different booths, you'll notice a sign just up the front, okay? And it has something that it really got my mind thinking, where it said the future is open. All right, so I'll just let you dwell on that just for a second, where the future is open. Now, imagine a world where every decision maker within the organization, from your CEO to any sort of frontline employee, has immediate access to insights that they require. Now, this isn't just a dream, right? This is actually a reality, and it is the future that we're currently building now, where we actually have this ability to be able to enable people and members within our organization through the power of democratizing data. So from that particular thought, you guys, most of you will be leaders or innovators, right? And of course, members that have come over to Summit. And so you basically understand and you get data, right? You understand the power of data. However, for most of us, how many of us actually truly understand how to implement that within the organization in a democratized way? So resting on that point, if we're looking at members within the organization and being able to enable them at this rapid speed, right? What we're actually looking at is we're looking at reducing friction, and we're also looking at reducing the wait time that is taken. Now, most of the organizations that you're probably part of might think that you're not really there in your journey yet, and that's completely okay. You might have challenges that you have to deal with. Some of those challenges might include our data is siloed. Another one might be that we're looking at access to data. All right, so you want to make sure that our access is secure. Two things which Databricks has covered really well, right? And I suppose the third part of that is looking at how we're going to be, for smaller teams, there's a large emphasis and pressure put on them to be able to provide insights to the rest of the organization, and actually takes away from their day-to-day job, which actually makes it really inefficient for them. So I suppose the talk today, as I mentioned before, is looking at a high-level methodology and architecture that can be put in place within your organization that will allow you to be able to reduce those blockers that you saw or that I mentioned before. And then also to think about it in this way is that Databricks and you being with Databricks is a really good partnership, mainly because they are driving this and they are leading the charge in terms of looking at that future is open in this whole data-driven culture. So just running on the first point that I mentioned, this is a common use case that we see with most of our clients, right? I work in consulting services. I get to hang out with quite a few different people across multiple different industries. And the main thing that I keep seeing is that the data engineers, or previously DBAs, had a lot of time taken away out of their jobs, their day-to-day jobs, to be able to serve the business whereas now, in this particular era that we're in, this can be done in a self-serving way. So in terms of what the vision is, this is actually looking at a multi-agent system for conversation. So allowing members within the organization to use natural language, which means I don't need to know SQL, I don't need to know Python, and even if I don't know SQL well, I can still be able to utilize this, all right? And so looking at this as a very high-level architecture, you'll see I've got a smiley face up the front because he is really happy that he's able to interact with an application that within underlying that, you basically have got a system in place which is constructed of agents in a supervisor and agent with actual tools underneath manner where the supervisor can actually start communicating downwards in terms of being able to offload and route any sort of information. So the main purpose of this is that you're looking at a bridging the gap between users and the governed data within Unity Catalog, which is the main feature, right? You want to make sure that the applications that you're building are secure and that you actually do have that authentication and authorization correctly implemented to make sure that only the right people who need to access the data get to access it as well. And as mentioned before, we're looking at those users asking the natural questions, and then basically this whole emphasis on the securely shared within the organization, or this application within the organization. So thinking about it from a systems architecture components part, the first one we have is looking at the Databricks app. So we're leveraging the full Databricks platform. As was mentioned in the keynote today, we're looking at bringing those applications down to the data layer as opposed to what we're doing currently. The second one is a system orchestrated by LangGraph. I don't know how many of you are familiar with LangGraph, how many of you have utilized it before? All right, so as you know, LangGraph actually enables you to be able to have multiple cycles, you'll actually have states, and then it's also governed by your nodes and your edges in terms of that relationship and that workflow that you put in place, which actually gives it a very powerful leverage with regards to what we utilize within the application, with regards to the system. So the final part that we're looking at in terms of the components is looking at the agents. Now the main one is going to be your brain. And the brain you can think of as basically managing that ultimate workflow. From there, you're looking at the second agent, which is basically your Genie agent. And this is utilizing Genie over the top of Unity Catalog to be able to use that natural language and return that SQL back to you, or that text answer that you require. And the final agent is a chart generator, which basically creates your data visualizations. Now there's different ways of doing this. As I mentioned, this is high level, so I've kept it relatively agnostic in terms of the approach that you utilize. In terms of a small little app that I built out as like a test for this particular convention is basically using Streamlit. And so it's actually passing through a string in terms of what that visualization is supposed to look like, and that is rendered using Streamlit itself for their visualization. So now it's time to meet the agents. So our first agent, as mentioned before, is our supervisor agent. And this is basically your central coordinator and the router or router of any sort of requests that need to be made from the user down to the necessary agents that are required. Now, the main role of the agent is to determine the user's intent and be able to understand how it should actually route those tasks to either Genie or to the chart generator. And finally, you're looking at that management of state as well with regards to that conversation and those data flows. The second agent that we have is the Genie agent. And so this is based on the APIs that are available through Genie. And it's basically where you get to utilize that natural language SQL translator that can be utilized by Genie, mainly for the purposes of that implemented as a callable tool for the supervisor. It'll basically interact with Databricks Genie Conversations API. And it's basically looking at targeting the specific pre-configured Genie space that has been done. Now the caveats for this, right, and there are three main ones, is that the success heavily relies on how well curated your Genie space is, right? And that takes into account any sort of metadata, any instructions, and any examples that you do feed through. So as we know from the data side, garbage in equals garbage out, right? And so if you're looking at being able to fully utilize, you'd want to make sure that you do take care of that Genie space to ensure that what the results that you get are complete. Now, the third agent and final agent is the chart generator. So basically this creates a static chart from the data. It's invoked by your supervisor agent where the actual data set is actually passed through in that state. It then references that state and is able to basically create a string which is then going to be rendered by Streamlit. So for this, you're also looking at using an LLM to be able to generate that visualization. Now there are different ways of doing this. You can actually store the images, so you can create the images and then store them statically and then reference those afterwards is another approach. So I suppose the next section that we'll go into is looking at the platform integration and control. So with this, as I mentioned before, we're looking at LangGraph, and the basic functionality and purpose of LangGraph is used for building those stateful and controllable agent workflows. It also looks at managing the state and defines also the logic that's going to be utilized. Second one, we're looking at Unity Catalog, which is your governance data or your governed data within Unity. And the final one is looking at authentication. So there's multiple different mechanisms that you can use for authentication. One is like a self-generated PAT token. The other method you can also use is through service principals, also an OAuth 2 M2M method, where you're actually having the user log into a browser, which basically creates a session for them for about an hour. And then after that, it'll actually recreate that session for them after that. So looking at the Databricks app, as I said, I threw this together in a matter of hours in terms of the full end-to-end. And so the chatbot that we have here is just an interaction that we have where we're basically having this model that's deployed. So that system that I spoke about before is actually packaged up, and we utilize MLflow to then look at deploying those into our Unity catalog as a model, and then basically referencing it to a service endpoint for consumption. So we can work with multiple versions. You can wind back on versions if you notice that, say for instance, you do have inaccuracies with the results that you're getting. And so the main purpose of this is just to look at the interface that you'd have. As I said, very basic. We have that query being sent to the agent, and then we have the display of a response that comes out at the end in the form of a data frame. Now, what does the end-to-end journey look like? That doesn't work. So you can see we start off with the user. The user posts a natural language query. The application receives the query and then pushes that query down into that registered model or that service endpoint. The service endpoint's supervisor agent receives the query. It gets the intent. It then routes that through to Genie. From Genie, it then receives the query, generates a response, returns a response, and then that goes back into our supervisor agent, which checks to see if there's a requirement for a visualization to be created. If there is a requirement, then basically it routes it through to the chart agent. The chart agent receives it. It basically generates the code that's required to be able to render that image, and then returns us back as a final message through to the control agent. And then from there, we look at them being rendered and displayed in the application for the end user to be able to perform or to consume. So in terms of what this looks like from a coding perspective, we're looking at basically building the tools. Now, for those of you who are familiar with LangGraph, you know that your agents would have access to tools. They can have access to communicating in terms of with edges to other agents, as well as functions that you have defined. So in this particular example, we're looking at utilizing classes to break down what each of those return strings is going to look like. And these strings are what I was talking about when I mentioned that we're looking at having these come back through, and then for that rendering at the end. So we define the classes that are required for the tool. The next step that we have is looking at the actual prompts that we'd have for each of them. So you'd see for the Genie agent, it's being very specific in terms of what its task is. The code agent's description as well. We can have a code agent available for this as well. And the final one, which is looking at your chart agent, which is basically, if we have a look at the bottom, where it has the other JSON formats and examples, it basically will list out each of the different visualizations that can be rendered. It has a format in terms of what is acceptable. Now, the classes that we defined before are basically checking to see whether or not it fits that criteria. Because at the end of it, we're looking at a dynamic return direct back to the supervisor agent from there, mainly because what you'd have is if you don't use your return direct, you'd actually have a summarization that's built at the end. So you'd have your string coming back perfectly fine, it's gone through a number of checks, finally gets one that's correct. Then basically your agent would then give you a summarization and it'll come as a string, as a text string in terms of that answer that's being given. Now in terms of the next part, we're looking at defining the agent state. And so what you can see is that we're utilizing the endpoints. Now, unfortunately for me, I did all the development inside Databricks Express and it didn't give me Claude. I couldn't get access to Claude. I tried multiple different ways. I tried Llama as well. And so I actually ended up creating a model within Azure and then registering that service endpoint within Databricks for this particular example. So what I'm doing at the first part is I'm looking at my Genie space ID. Now this could be parameterized, right? And so it passes the Genie space ID in, and then we're looking at the construction of your Genie agent, which includes looking at the Genie space ID, the Genie agent name, and also the description, which we defined earlier above, which is basically your initial prompt. So this is the first prompt that's given before whatever the question is appended, and that question is routed or created via your supervisor agent. The next one is the final one, which you have is the chart agent. I did have a separate coder agent as well, which I tried out. Genie did the same task. So I did have a coder agent, which basically means that any sort of code, whether it's Python, whether it's SQL, can be generated by the same LLM that I defined before, which is my GPT-4o. In terms of defining the graph nodes, this is basically the meat of it. This is looking at how each of the nodes are going to be interacting with each other and what that workflow looks like and what the edges look like as well. Now, I have to wrap things up. I've got 2 more minutes. So the main thing is looking at handling ambiguity and limitations. So the system by itself handles any sort of issues gracefully, right? The Genie clarification, it detects Genie, asking for more information, then routes the question back to the user. Now, if Genie cannot answer, it basically detects if Genie can't answer and then provides a helpful message back to the user. And the final one is looking at tool errors. So it's basically those classes that we define are going to be catching whatever those tool errors are and then waiting and retrying until it actually gets the required output. Now, the payoff versus your benefits and value. So as mentioned before, the core value is that democratization of the data. You want to be able to make this accessible to everyone within your organization, right, who's got access to that particular data. Now, the good thing is with these models that we do build and we deploy as service endpoints, I can have multiple Genie workspaces referencing these. So I don't need to have a duplicate of these agents. I can actually basically have multiple workspaces that actually reference these and then multiple applications on the end of that. So we're looking at the empowerments of the business users, increase the analyst productivity, better utilization for governed data, and enhances data literacy, and then is consistent and reliable with regards to the results. Now, looking ahead for future enhancements, we want to have more complex multi-turn conversations. We want to be able to make sure that we have this interactive charts. So you could look at utilizing Plotly for that. We want to look at the human in the loop. That was mentioned in our keynote, right? We have human in the loop to make sure that the data that we're getting back or the results that we're getting back are accurate. We also want to make sure that there's other scenarios where you could have a RAG-enabled agent as well. So you could be looking at documents and blend these into that one model. And there's the performance, cost, and scalability improvements that can be done, because that'll be the main thing that you want to wrangle with, is basically based on those costs. So I put up the forward statement from Databricks. And then we just ask that you do complete the survey for this particular session. I thank you so much for attending. It's been great. It went by so fast. And yeah, if you have any questions, please make your way over to our booth. You'll see it's under Insight. I wish I had somebody there to wave, but we can actually walk you over. There we go. You can follow these people over here waving at the back row. They'll take you over to that. Please make sure you scan in. If you require any sort of videos and so forth, please put a note in for that. I'll be happy to share those with you. Thank you very much.